it's so convenient to think of Nazi ideology as this really neat and logical system, you know, with a hierarchy, I don't know, Aryans at the top, Jews at the bottom. But it turns out that the Nazi system was actually pretty murky, and that all of these hierarchies, certain points were fixed. There's no doubt that a fixed point in Nazi thinking was Jews, anyone defined as a Jew, they would be erased, annihilated from the face of the earth. But Aryan, the supposed opposite of Jew, was of course a completely made up category. What's an Aryan, right? We like to think, well, blonde, blue-eyed, you know, there's all those jokes about, you know, what did Hitler look like and so on. There's not a clear thing called an Aryan. It was always defined in opposition, always defined kind of as an aspirational category rather than something that truly existed. So if you think about, you know, the kind of stages in between, certainly you can find those racial scientists who had really fine distinctions of looking literally at people's facial features or, you know, linguistic units and so on. But then when you look at how the war itself and genocide played out, you see that most of those categories shifted and changed over time, some of them considerably. So you mentioned Scandinavians. Let's start with that. Obviously, in some way for many German, you know, racial and ethnic kind of thinkers, Scandinavians, Dutch people, they were related populations. The idea is that these are people we can work with. However, if you look at how it played out during the war, you'll see that a lot depended on, were they friendly or hostile toward Nazi Germany? Sweden was a neutral state. Well, while the Germans were winning the war, the Swedes tended to be quite friendly and cooperative. When the tide of the war turned, that also changed. And likewise, the way Nazis tended to talk about Swedes changed as well, right? Or Norwegians is another example. Well, you know, it turned out to be quite difficult for the Germans to conquer and control Norway. And the idea of this sort of ethnic brethren tended to extend to collaborators like Quisling, but somehow resistors could be treated very, very brutally. The same with, you mentioned, the Slavic people. You know, a lot of times we used to say in the field, I think that fit the Cold War notion that Slavs were a victim group. But when you stop and think about it, it's not that obvious. I mentioned earlier Yugoslavia. Think about it. Yugoslavia, country of the South Slavs. Croats, Serbs, they're all Slavic people in terms of the language. However, Croats, the Ustasha, Croatian state, that was a client regime, cooperated closely with Nazi Germany. You know, Serbs, occupied population, not so close. Poles resisted bitterly the German attack, never formed a collaborator government, paid a very, very high price. Czechs, much less carnage against them. Slovaks, the first state that actually handed over their own Jews to the Germans for killing. So the treatment of Slavic populations, it varied enormously. And a lot depended on, you could say, just sheer calculations about politics and security. But this is where you realize that the treatment of Jews really was different. Even Slavic populations that could be, you know, derided as inferior, barbaric, and so on, as the Germans began losing the war, they started kidnapping kids, right, from Poland, from Belarus, and elsewhere, and thinking we can Germanize those children. Jewish children were the first to be killed. They were not kidnapped and turned over. So you see, like, the hierarchy in between, let's say, that fixed point of Jews as the enemy, there was quite a bit of play and movement, which some people could use to their advantage at times, but which could also make people extremely vulnerable, right? Ukrainians, at certain points, the Germans might think, these can be our partners. You know, at other points, they would say, no, they're good for forced labor and nothing more. So I think the hierarchy, a lot of it was quite cynical and could be, yeah, kind of shifted to fit with the needs of Nazis in power.